She's in the kitchen again. My daughter-in-law Vanessa's voice carried through the hallway, sharp and deliberate, meant for me to hear. Your mother can eat there. We're entertaining important people tonight, and honestly, Paul, she'll just bring down the whole atmosphere. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I stood frozen by the guest bathroom mirror, my carefully applied lipstick trembling slightly in my hand. At 72, I'd gotten used to the small indignities that come with aging, but never from my own family. Never in my own son's home. Mom won't mind, Paul replied, his voice lower but clear enough. My heart sank at how quickly he'd conceded. She understands how these dinner parties work. I didn't understand, not really. Not when it was my third time that month eating alone at their kitchen island while laughter floated from the dining room. Not when I'd helped pay for the very house they were so proud to show off. I set the lipstick down, studied my reflection. The silver hair I'd styled carefully that morning, the good pearl earrings I'd worn for the occasion, the slight tremble in my lined face that betrayed everything I was trying to hide. Let's eat, Margaret, I whispered to myself. Just get through tonight. But something had shifted in me. Maybe it was the casual cruelty in Vanessa's tone. Maybe it was seeing how thoroughly my son had forgotten who raised him. Or maybe it was simply the last straw after 2 years of slowly being erased from my own family. I picked up my phone and made one call. Just one. To a number I'd saved but never had the courage to dial. Hello, Nathan. It's Peggy Johnson. About that offer of yours. I think I'm ready to discuss it. 6 months later, my son and his wife would be packing boxes, watching Movers Cart, away their designer furniture, and explaining to their prestigious neighbors why they had to suddenly downsize. But that satisfaction was still to come. For now, I was just an old woman being told to eat in the kitchen, summoning a strength I'd forgotten I had. My name is Margaret Johnson, but everyone's always called me Peggy. At least they used to, back when people called me anything at all. These days, I mostly hear Paul's mother, or Mrs. Johnson, or sometimes just her. Amazing how quickly 72 years of living gets reduced to a relationship or an afterthought. I wasn't always the woman eating alone in the kitchen. There was a time when I filled rooms with my presence, when my opinion mattered, when my life felt like my own. That woman seemed impossibly distant now as I sat perched on a kitchen stool in my son's sprawling Atlanta home, listening to the clink of crystal and polite laughter floating from the formal dining room 15 feet and a whole world away. The salmon on my plate had gone cold. Vanessa had instructed their housekeeper Louisa to fix a plate for Mrs. Johnson before the guests arrived. The food itself was excellent. My daughter-in-law was nothing if not particular about appearances, but eating alone made everything taste like dust. Would you like more water, Mrs. Johnson? Louisa appeared beside me, pitcher in hand, sympathy in her eyes. No, thank you, dear, I said, summoning a smile. But sit with me a moment if you have time. She glanced nervously toward the dining room. I should check on the second course. Just a minute, I said, patting the stool beside me. They won't notice. That was the sad truth. They wouldn't notice if I disappeared entirely, much less if their housekeeper took a moment's rest. Louisa hesitated, then perched beside me. She was a slight woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and the perpetually tired look of someone who's spent a lifetime accommodating others. How long have you worked for them? I asked. 3 years, Mrs. Johnson. And in all that time, has my son, Paul, has he ever asked about your family? Your children? Her eyes widened slightly. No, Mrs. Johnson. I nodded, unsurprised. He used to be different, I said softly. Before the money. Before her. More laughter erupted from the dining room, Vanessa's rising above the rest. Practiced. Performative. I'd come to recognize that laugh. It was reserved for people she wanted something from. "Mrs. Johnson," Louisa said hesitantly, "my daughter graduates next month. First in our family with a college degree. In nursing." My face broke into a genuine smile. "Louisa, that's wonderful. You must be so proud." Her eyes glistened. "Very proud. I wanted to ask for the day off, but—" She trailed off, glancing, again toward the dining room. "They said no?" I guessed. "Mrs. Vanessa is hosting a charity luncheon that day. Very important people coming." I felt something harden inside me. "What's your daughter's name?" "Elena." "And when exactly is her graduation?" As Louisa told me the details, something crystallized in my mind. A decision, a turning point. I'd spent 2 years shrinking myself to fit into increasingly smaller spaces in my son's life, watching as Vanessa systematically relegated me to the background. First, it was separate holiday celebrations because Vanessa's family traditions are different. Then I was moved from the guest room to the converted office when her parents visited. Now I was eating in the kitchen while they entertained. All this in the house that wouldn't exist without me. The house that sat on land I'd helped them buy with money from selling the family home after Robert, my husband, passed away. They'd never directly asked me to contribute, of course. Paul had just mentioned their dream property was slightly out of reach, and I'd offered the money as a gift. No strings attached, I'd said. No expectations. What a fool I'd been. After Louisa returned to her duties, I finished my cold salmon and washed my plate, careful not to leave any evidence of my existence that might embarrass them. Then I slipped upstairs to my converted office bedroom and closed the door. I sat on the edge of the bed, surrounded by the few possessions I'd kept when I sold my home to move closer to Paul, my only child, my supposed support system as I aged. The framed photo of Robert and me on our 30th anniversary. The small jewelry box containing more sentimental than valuable pieces. The stack of books I'd been reading and rereading to fill the lonely hours. I picked up my phone and scrolled to a contact I'd saved months ago but never called. Nathan Phillips, real estate attorney. I'd met Nathan at a community center event shortly after moving to Atlanta. He'd given a talk about elder law and property rights, and afterward had mentioned, almost casually, that the arrangement with my son's house sounded concerning from a legal standpoint. He'd given me his card, told me to call if I ever needed advice. "Your contribution likely constitutes partial ownership, Mrs. Johnson," he'd said, even without formal documentation. I'd smiled politely and tucked his card away, unwilling to imagine a scenario where I'd need such protection from my own son. That night, listening to strangers laugh in a home that should have been partly mine, I finally made the call. "Nathan," answered on the third ring, his voice alert despite the evening hour. "Mr. Phillips?" I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "This is Margaret Johnson. We met at the Peachtree Senior Center talk you gave in February." "Mrs. Johnson, of course. How are you?" "Not well," I admitted. "You mentioned my situation might have legal implications. I think I'm ready to explore that." There was a pause, and when he spoke again, his voice was gentle but firm. "I remember your case, the property contribution without formal recognition of ownership. Would you like to come to my office tomorrow?" "Yes," I said, feeling a strange mixture of dread and relief. Yes, I would. I hung up and sat in the quiet of my small room, listening to the party continue without me. For the first time in years, I felt something other than resignation stir inside me. Not quite anger, not quite hope. Determination. Yes, that was it. A sense that I wasn't entirely powerless after all. I thought of Robert then, of what he would say if he could see how our son was allowing me to be treated. Robert had been the gentlest of men, but fiercely protective of those he loved. He'd worked as a high school science teacher for 40 years, passing up better-paying opportunities because he believed in shaping young minds. We'd lived modestly but happily, saving carefully, raising Paul with values I no longer recognized in him. "What happened to our boy, Robert?" I whispered to the empty room. The next morning, I told Paul I was meeting a friend for coffee. He barely looked up from his phone, mumbling something about being home late. Vanessa didn't even pretend to acknowledge me. Focused on her laptop at the kitchen island, planning another event that would surely require my absence. Nathan Phillips's office was in a modest building downtown, nothing like the gleaming skyscrapers where Paul worked as an investment manager. The attorney was older than I remembered, perhaps in his early 60s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a methodical way of speaking that I found reassuring. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, after I'd explained my situation in detail. "What your son and daughter-in-law have done isn't just unkind, it potentially constitutes financial exploitation." I flinched at the term. That sounds so harsh. "The law can be harsh but also protective," he said gently. "You contributed nearly 40% of the purchase price of that property, with no written agreement but a clear verbal understanding that you would be part of the household. Since then, you've been systematically marginalized in a home you helped create." When he put it that way, something broke loose inside me, a truth I'd been avoiding. "What can I do?" I asked. Nathan leaned forward. "Several things. First, we document everything. Your financial contribution, the verbal agreements, the pattern of treatment. Then, we have options ranging from negotiation to legal action." "I don't want to sue my son," I said quickly. "Understandable. But we can use legal leverage to facilitate a conversation he's clearly unwilling to have otherwise." Nathan's expression softened. "Mrs. Johnson, may I speak frankly?" I nodded. People who behave this way, who take advantage of family members, rarely stop on their own. Without consequences, the behavior typically escalates. I thought of the progression, from the guest room to the office, from family dinners to eating, in the kitchen, from mom to barely acknowledged presence. "What's the next step?" I asked. "I propose sending a formal letter outlining your partial ownership claim and requesting either appropriate accommodation in the home or financial compensation for your contribution. This often leads to negotiation rather than court. And if it doesn't?" Nathan's expression was serious. "Then we pursue legal remedies. Georgia has strong elder protection laws, Mrs. Johnson. You have more power than you realize." I left his office with a strange lightness. For months, I'd felt invisible, diminished. Now someone was seeing me. Not as Paul's mother or an inconvenient, old woman, but as a person with rights, with dignity. That evening, I watched Paul and Vanessa more carefully, the way they spoke around me rather than to me. The subtle exchanges when I expressed an opinion, a small eye roll from Vanessa, a dismissive smile from Paul. Had it always been this way? Had I been too desperate for my son's approval to notice? A week later, Nathan's letter arrived at the house. I knew because Vanessa stormed into my room without knocking, the opened envelope trembling in her hand. "What is this?" she demanded, her carefully maintained composure fractured. I set down my book calmly. "It appears to be a letter from my attorney." "Your attorney?" Her voice rose an octave. "Since when do you have an attorney? And what's this about owning part of our house?" I met her gaze steadily. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I contributed nearly half the purchase price, Vanessa. That was never meant to be a gift with no strings attached. It was an investment in a family home where I would be treated as family. Her face flushed with anger. "We've given you a place to live, fed you, included you." "Included me," I interrupted, surprised at my own boldness. "I eat in the kitchen during your dinner parties. I sleep in a converted office while your parents get the guest suite. The housekeeper can't even Take a day off to attend her daughter's college graduation. That's not your concern, she snapped. No, treating people with basic dignity isn't my concern. I stood up, and something in my posture must have changed because Vanessa took a small step back. Everything in this letter is accurate, Vanessa. You and Paul have choices to make now. She left without another word, slamming the door behind her. I sat back down, my heart racing, but my mind surprisingly clear. There would be no going back now. Paul came home early that evening, something that hadn't happened in months. He entered my room more gently than his wife had, but the letter was still clutched in his hand. "Mom," he said, and I could hear the forced patience in his voice, the tone he might use with a difficult client or a child. "What's going on? Why would you do this?" "Sit down, Paul," I said, gesturing to the chair across from me. He hesitated, then complied, probably calculating that humoring me was the quickest path to resolving the situation. "Do you remember when your father was dying?" I asked. The question clearly caught him off guard. "What does that have to do with this letter?" "Just answer, please." He shifted uncomfortably. "Of course I remember." "Do you remember what he asked of you? His last request?" Paul looked away. "Mom, that was years ago." 5 years, I agreed. "He asked you to look after me. Not financially, we'd saved enough for that, but as family. He worried I'd be lonely after 47 years of marriage." "And I've done that," Paul insisted. "You live with us. You're part of our lives." "Am I?" I leaned forward. "When was the last time you asked about my day? Or remembered that Tuesday is when I volunteer at the library? Or noticed that I've been wearing the same 3 outfits because most of my clothes are in boxes in your attic?" He had the grace to look ashamed, at least. "Things have been busy, Mom. The promotion, Vanessa's charity work. I understand busy, Paul. What I don't understand is cruelty." "Cruelty? That's not fair." "Isn't it? Last night I ate cold salmon in the kitchen, while you entertained people I've never met in a dining room I helped pay for. Your housekeeper wasn't allowed time off to attend her daughter's college graduation. These aren't the values your father and I taught you." Paul's expression hardened slightly, and I saw Vanessa's influence in the set of his jaw. "The letter says you're claiming ownership of our house. Is that really how you want to handle a family disagreement? With lawyers? Did I have another option? Would you have listened without one?" The silence that followed was answer enough. "What do you want, Mom?" he finally asked. "There are 2 possibilities outlined in the letter," I said calmly. "Either I receive appropriate recognition as a partial owner of this home, including respectful treatment and a proper living space, or you buy out my share at fair market value." He stood abruptly. "I'll need to discuss this with Vanessa." "Of course," I said. "Attorney Phillips is available when you're ready to talk." After Paul left, I sat in the growing darkness of my room, wondering if I'd just destroyed my relationship with my only child. But a strange peace settled over me. For the first time since Robert died, since I sold our home to be closer to Paul, I was standing up for myself. The relief of that far outweighed the fear. The next few weeks were tense. Paul and Vanessa had consulted their own attorney, who apparently confirmed what Nathan had told me. I had a legitimate claim. They alternated between icy silence and awkward attempts at reconciliation that never quite included an apology. "Mom, you know we value having you here," Paul said one evening, in what I recognized as a rehearsed speech. "We never meant to make you feel unwelcome." I simply looked at him until he glanced away. "We're willing to convert the guest room back to your permanent space," he continued. "And of course you'll join us for all meals going forward." "And Louisa?" I asked. "Will she be allowed to attend her daughter's graduation?" He blinked, surprised. "What does that have to do with our situation?" "Everything, Paul. It speaks to the kind of household you're running, the values you're living by. He didn't have an answer for that. In the end, they made their choice. Not the one I'd hoped for, but perhaps the one that revealed the truth most clearly. They would buy out my share of the house, nearly $200,000 given the current market, rather than truly change how they treated me. "We think this is best for everyone," Vanessa said, not quite meeting my eyes as they presented their decision. A fresh start. I nodded, feeling an odd mixture of sadness and relief. I agree. The day the agreement was finalized, I sat with Nathan in his office, watching as he explained each document before I signed. "Are you sure about this, Mrs. Johnson?" he asked, his kind eyes searching my face. "You have every right to fight for your place in that home." I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in years. "I'm sure. Some houses never become homes, no matter how long you live there." With the settlement check deposited, I made 2 decisions that would change everything. First, I found a lovely 2-bedroom apartment in a senior living community that offered both independence and community. The kind of place where people gathered for coffee in the mornings and movie nights on Thursdays, where no one ate alone unless they chose to. Second, I made another call. This one to a non-profit organization that helped first-generation college graduates with housing deposits for their first professional apartments. I established a fund in honor of Luisa's daughter, Elena, starting with enough to help 10 nursing graduates secure their first homes. But there was one more piece of satisfaction to come, one I hadn't planned but couldn't help appreciating. It turned out that Paul and Vanessa's prestigious address had been leveraged alongside some other questionable financial decisions. The forced buyout of my share had strained resources that were already stretched thinner than their luxury lifestyle suggested. Within 6 months, foreclosure notices appeared. Their carefully curated image began to crumble. I heard about it not from them. We spoke rarely now, awkward phone calls on holidays. But from Luisa, who had indeed attended her daughter's graduation, and now worked for a family that respected her enough to learn her children's names. "They're moving to an apartment," she told me during one of our regular coffee dates. "Mrs. Vanessa is very upset about the address. Not the right zip code," she says. I felt no joy in their downfall, only a lingering sadness for what might have been. But I didn't regret my decision to stand up for myself, to refuse the indignity of being hidden away. In my new home, I made friends who valued my company. I volunteered teaching English to recent immigrants, using skills from my 40 years as an elementary school teacher. I joined a book club and a walking group. I lived fully, visibly, unapologetically. Sometimes when I host dinner parties in Thai, my modest but warm apartment, I think about those cold meals eaten alone at the kitchen island. How silent acceptance of small cruelties paves the way for larger ones. How standing up for your own dignity sometimes means making difficult choices. My name is Margaret Johnson. I am 73 years old. I spent 1 year eating in the kitchen, treated as an inconvenience in a house I helped create. Then I made one phone call that changed everything. Not just their address, but the way I allow myself to be treated for whatever years I have left. The salmon tastes better at my own table, surrounded by people who see me. The conversation is warmer, and no one, not ever, is sent to eat alone in the kitchen. I kept the letter from Nathan Phillips in my purse for 3 days before finally working up the courage to show Paul. My son had always been the peacemaker in our family, the one who smoothed things over, who found the middle ground. Even as a child, he'd been the first to apologize after arguments, the first to offer compromises. But somewhere along the way, that thoughtful boy had disappeared, replaced by a man who seemed to look right through me. The morning I decided to show him the letter, the house was quiet. Vanessa had left early for her weekly tennis match, followed by brunch with friends she called the committee ladies. Paul was in his home office, the door ajar, his attention focused on the multiple screens that dominated his desk. I knocked softly on the doorframe. "Paul, do you have a minute?" He glanced up, distracted. "Can it wait, Mom? I've got a client call in 15. "It's important," I said, stepping into the room uninvited. This itself was unusual. I'd grown, accustomed to respecting the invisible boundaries that had been established throughout the house, the spaces that were silently marked as, "not for me." Something in my tone must have registered because he pushed back slightly from his desk. "What's wrong? Are you feeling all right?" The concern was automatic, superficial, the kind you'd offer a distant acquaintance, not your mother. "I'm not ill," I said, settling into the chair across from him. "But we need to talk about my position in this household." His expression shifted immediately, a flicker of impatience crossing his features. "Mom, if this is about the dinner party last week, it's about much more than that." I withdrew Nathan's letter from my purse and placed it on the desk between us. "This is from my attorney." "Your attorney?" The confusion in his voice might have been comical under different circumstances. The idea that his mother, the woman, who had been silently accommodating every slight and diminishment for the past 2 years, would consult a lawyer was clearly incomprehensible to him. "Yes," I said simply. "Please, read it." As he scanned the document, I watched his face carefully. The initial confusion gave way to disbelief, then something harder. When he finally looked up, I didn't recognize the coldness in his eyes. "This is absurd," he said flatly. "You're claiming ownership of our house? Based on what? The money you gave us? That was a gift, Mom. You said so yourself." "I gave you that money so we could have a family home," I corrected him gently. "Where I would be treated as family, not as an inconvenience to be hidden away when company comes." "We've given you a place to live," he countered, his voice rising slightly. "We've taken care of you." "Have you?" I asked, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "When was the last time you asked how I was spending my days? Or introduced me to your friends? Or included me in a family decision?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. In the silence that followed, I could almost see him searching for examples and coming up empty. "This isn't about the money, Paul," I continued. "It's about dignity. It's about being treated as a full member of this household, not an afterthought." He shuffled the papers, not meeting my eyes. "What exactly are you asking for?" "The letter outlines 2 options," I said. "Either I receive appropriate acknowledgement as a part owner of this home, which includes respectful treatment and a proper living space, or you buy out my investment at current market value." Paul's jaw tightened. "I need to discuss this with Vanessa." "Of course," I nodded. "Attorney Phillips is available when you're ready to talk." I walked out of his office feeling strangely light, as though I'd set down a heavy burden I'd been carrying for years. The relief of finally standing up for myself outweighed the anxiety of what would come next. That evening, I heard them arguing. Behind the closed door of their bedroom, Vanessa's voice rose occasionally, sharp with indignation. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone told me everything I needed to know. She was not pleased. The next morning, the atmosphere in the house was glacial. Vanessa left without a word, the slam of the front door punctuating her exit. Paul lingered over his coffee at the kitchen island, finally addressing me as I washed my breakfast dishes. "We're consulting our own attorney," he said stiffly. "This feels like an ambush, Mom." I dried my hands carefully on a dish towel before turning to face him. "I understand it feels that way to you. To me, it feels like a last resort after years of trying to belong in this house." "What are you talking about? We've never excluded you." The genuine bewilderment in his voice almost made me doubt myself. Had I imagined the pattern of small dismissals, the gradual erosion of my place in their lives? "No." I straightened my shoulders. Last Thanksgiving, I said quietly. You and Vanessa decided to accept an invitation to her colleague's house instead of our traditional family dinner. You didn't consult me, just informed me of the change. I spent the holiday alone. He shifted uncomfortably. You could have come with us. I wasn't invited, Paul. When I asked, Vanessa said it would be awkward to bring an extra guest. She probably just meant my birthday in March, I continued. You and Vanessa had tickets to a charity gala. You gave me a card 3 days late. We're busy people, Mom. That's not the same as excluding you. The weekend your college? Friends visited. I prepared a special breakfast for everyone, but you all left for brunch at that new place downtown before I'd even set the table. Each example landed like a small stone between us. Not dramatic incidents, not outright cruelty, just a steady pattern of thoughtlessness that had slowly but surely communicated my unimportance. Paul ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so reminiscent of his father that my heart ached. I had no idea you were keeping score. Not keeping score, I corrected him. Just finally acknowledging a pattern. He checked his watch, another dismissal. I have to get to work. We'll figure this out, Mom. Just give us some time. After he left, I wandered through the silent house, seeing it with new eyes. This sprawling 5-bedroom home in Buckhead, with its soaring ceilings and designer furniture, had never felt like mine despite my substantial investment in it. Everything from the sterile white kitchen, where Vanessa prepared elaborate meals for guests but rarely for family, to the formal living room, where I'd been subtly discouraged from sitting because the pristine upholstery was sensitive to oils, felt like a museum I was merely visiting. The only space that bore any trace of me was my converted office bedroom, and even that had been minimized. My cherished books relegated to a single shelf, my family photos confined to the bedside table, where guests wouldn't see them, my quilt-making supplies stored in plastic bins under the bed rather than displayed in the open. I traced my fingers along the cool marble countertop in the kitchen, thinking about the modest home where I'd raised Paul. It had been half this size, but infinitely warmer. Robert and I had saved for years to afford that split level in a good school district, prioritizing education over square footage. We'd hosted crowded, boisterous dinner parties where everyone squeezed around our expandable dining table. No one had ever been sent to eat in the kitchen. The memory of Robert brought a fresh wave of grief. 5 years gone, and I still reached for him in the night sometimes. He would have been appalled by what our son had become, not because of the financial success or the prestigious address, but because of the values that had been sacrificed along the way. My phone buzzed with a text from Nathan. Any response to the letter? I typed back. Initial conversation held. They're consulting their attorney. Nathan's reply came quickly. Good. Stand firm. This is about more than money. He was right. Of course. The financial aspect was significant. My contribution of nearly $200,000 represented most of what I'd received from selling our family home after Robert's death. But the deeper issue was one of respect, of visibility, of having a voice in a household I'd helped create. That evening, Vanessa came home earlier than usual. I was in the kitchen preparing a simple dinner for myself. Paul had texted that he would be working late when she appeared in the doorway, her posture rigid. We need to talk, she said without preamble. I turned off the stove and faced her. All right. She perched on one of the island stools, her designer handbag placed carefully beside her like a shield. I've spoken with our attorney, she began. Her tone clipped. He agrees there may be some ambiguity regarding your contribution to the house. I waited, saying nothing. However, she continued, he also points out that you've been living here rent-free for 2 years. That counts for something. It does, I agreed mildly. Though I've contributed in other ways. I cook 3 dinners a week. I handle the grocery shopping. I maintain the garden that you showcase to your friends. Her lips thinned. Those are Household chores, not rent. And what would you consider fair rent for the converted office where I sleep? I asked. The space that was supposedly temporary until the proper guest room was made available to me? A flash of something, guilt perhaps, crossed her face before she regained her composure. "We're prepared to make changes," she said, clearly reciting a rehearsed speech. "The guest room can become your permanent space again. You'll be included, in all family meals, of course. We can discuss other accommodations as needed." I studied her carefully. There was no real contrition in her offer, just calculation. The grudging concessions of someone who'd been cornered, not the genuine change of heart I'd hoped for. And what about respect, Vanessa? That's not something you can put in a legal agreement. She blinked, genuinely puzzled. "I don't know what you mean. The way you speak about me to others, as though I'm a burden you've nobly taken on. The way you dismiss my opinions. The way you've gradually isolated me from Paul's life." Her expression hardened. "That's not fair. We've given you a home when many elderly parents end up in facilities. We've included you in our lives." "As an accessory," I said quietly. "Not as a person with value beyond my relationship to Paul." Vanessa stood abruptly. "I think we should continue this conversation with the attorneys present. Clearly, we have different perceptions of the situation." After she left, I returned to my interrupted dinner preparation, hands slightly shaky but resolve intact. The conversation had confirmed what I'd already suspected. There was no path forward in this house that would restore my dignity. They might make superficial changes to avoid legal consequences, but the fundamental lack of respect would remain. That night, I called Nathan again. "I think I want to pursue the buyout option," I told him. "I don't believe the other scenario is viable long-term." "Are you certain?" he asked. "You're in a strong position legally. We could push for substantial changes to your living situation." "I'm certain," I said, surprised by the clarity I felt. Some relationships can't be repaired with legal documents. The next few weeks were tense but oddly liberating. Once I'd made my decision, a weight lifted from my shoulders. I began quietly researching alternative living options, visiting senior communities that offered independence along with a built-in social network. One in particular caught my attention: Magnolia Gardens, a modern complex with private apartments surrounding shared gardens and community spaces. It was closer to downtown, walking distance to the library where I volunteered and the small cafes I'd discovered during my solitary explorations of Atlanta. Paul and Vanessa maintained a cool distance, communicating primarily through terse texts about household logistics. Their attorney contacted Nathan to begin negotiating terms of the buyout. The process was revealing in itself. They tried initially to devalue my contribution, suggesting depreciation should be applied or that my room and board should be deducted from the amount. Nathan countered with market appreciation figures, showing my investment had actually grown in value, plus interest calculations for the interest-free loan I'd effectively provided. In the end, we settled on a figure that represented fair market value for my portion of the property, $215,000, slightly more than my initial investment due to Atlanta's booming real estate market. The day the agreement was finalized, I sat in Nathan's office reviewing the documents one last time before signing. "Are you absolutely sure this is what you want?" Nathan asked, his kind eyes searching my face. I smiled, feeling more certain than I had in years. "Yes, it's time to build my own life again. What will you do next?" he asked as I signed the final paper. "First, I'm putting a deposit on an apartment at Magnolia Gardens," I said. "And then I'm establishing a scholarship fund for nursing students." His eyebrows rose. "That's a significant portion of your settlement." "I know," I nodded. "But I've been inspired by Louisa's daughter. First-generation college graduates often struggle to establish themselves professionally. This fund will help with housing deposits, professional wardrobe costs, licensure fees, the practical expenses that can be barriers to success. Nathan smiled. Robert would be proud. The mention of my late husband's name brought the familiar but now mixed with something else, a sense that I was finally honoring his memory in a way that mattered. Robert had spent his life helping others, first as a high school science teacher and later as a volunteer literacy tutor. He'd believed in investing in people, not things. When I returned to Paul and Vanessa's house that afternoon, it would never again be our house in my mind. I found an envelope slipped under my door. Inside was a check for the full settlement amount and a brief note in Paul's handwriting. We hope this resolves the situation to everyone's satisfaction. No apology. No acknowledgement of what had been lost beyond the money. I folded the note carefully and placed it in my memory box alongside other keepsakes from this chapter of my life. A lesson learned at considerable emotional cost. The process of extracting myself from their home took less time than I expected. After 2 years, I'd never fully unpacked, never really settled in. My belongings fit into 6 medium-sized boxes, plus my clothing and a few pieces of furniture that had emotional significance. Robert's reading chair, my mother's vanity, the quilt rack my father had built for me. Paul helped load everything into the moving truck. Our conversation stilted and focused on logistics rather than emotions. Vanessa made herself scarce, citing a committee meeting that couldn't be rescheduled. As we stood in the driveway for our awkward goodbye, I searched my son's face for some sign of the boy I'd raised, the young man who had once prioritized family over appearances. "You know you can visit any time," he said. But the words rang hollow. "Thank you," I replied simply. There seemed nothing else to say that wouldn't edge toward either recrimination or false sentimentality. Whatever healing might come would require time and distance first. Magnolia Gardens welcomed me with unexpected warmth. My apartment was smaller than the space I'd had in Paul and Vanessa's house, but it was entirely mine. I could arrange my books on any shelf I wanted, hang my photographs on every wall, leave my quilting project spread across the dining table for days if I chose. The relief of that simple freedom was profound. Within weeks, I'd established new routines. Morning coffee with a group of residents in the community room, many of whom had professional backgrounds similar to mine in education. Tuesday, volunteering at the library's literacy program. Thursday, movie nights in the community theater. Weekend excursions to Atlanta's museums and parks, sometimes alone, sometimes with new friends who actually asked about my interests and opinions. I used part of the settlement to finally update my wardrobe, replacing the practical but dated clothes I'd held onto for years with styles that felt more vibrant, more reflective of who I was becoming, rather than who I'd been. When I caught sight of myself in store mirrors, I barely recognized the woman looking back. Not because I appeared younger or dramatically different, but because I stood straighter, smiled more readily, moved with purpose. The Elena Johnson Nursing Graduate Fund was established through a local foundation with an initial endowment of $50,000. I named it after Louisa's daughter as a testament to persistence and family sacrifice, but also after myself, reclaiming my full name, Margaret Peggy Elena Johnson, incorporating the middle name I'd rarely used, but which connected me to my Spanish grandmother. The first recipient was, fittingly, Louisa's daughter herself. I'd stayed in touch with Louisa, meeting for coffee every few weeks. She'd found a better position with a family who valued her expertise and respected her time. When I told her about the fund, she wept openly, then proudly helped her daughter complete the application. "This will change everything for her," Louisa told me. "She was going to have to live with my sister an hour from the hospital. Now she can afford an apartment near work." The ceremony awarding the first grants was small but significant. 5 recent nursing graduates, all from families where they were the first to attend college, all facing the practical challenges of launching professional careers. As I handed Elena her certificate, her eyes shining with determination and gratitude. I felt a sense of rightness so profound it took my breath away. This was what Robert and I had always valued: education, opportunity, the chance to build something meaningful. Not the hollow prestige that Paul and Vanessa chased so relentlessly. I didn't hear much from them in those first few months. A perfunctory birthday card, an occasional text checking if I needed anything, always worded in a way that maintained their position as benefactors rather than acknowledging our new, more distant relationship. I responded politely but briefly, focusing my emotional energy on building my new life rather than repairing what had been broken. Then, 6 months after I moved out, I received an unexpected call from a former neighbor in Paul's subdivision. "Peggy, I hope you don't mind me calling," Barbara began. "I got your number from the library volunteer roster. I just thought, I thought you should know what's happening." "What is it?" I asked, a flicker of concern surfacing despite everything. "There's a foreclosure notice on Paul and Vanessa's house," she said. "It went up yesterday. Everyone in the neighborhood is talking about it." The news shouldn't have shocked me as much as it did. I knew Paul's investment business had been struggling. He'd mentioned market volatility in our rare conversations. And Vanessa's spending had always seemed disproportionate to their actual resources, something Robert had worried about even before his death. "Do you know any details?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "Just rumors," Barbara admitted. "Something about leveraged investments going bad. And there's talk that they've been living beyond their means for years, keeping up appearances, but drowning in debt. The buyout they gave you apparently strained their already precarious finances." After thanking her for the information, I sat quietly in my sunny living room, processing the news. My first instinct was concern for my son. Regardless of how he'd treated me, I didn't wish financial ruin on him. My second thought was more complicated. A small, undeniable satisfaction that the facade had finally crumbled, that the prestigious address and perfect image they'd prioritized over genuine connection had proven as ephemeral as I'd suspected. I didn't call Paul immediately. Instead, I took time to consider my response carefully. The settlement money was mine, rightfully earned and legally obtained. I was under no obligation to rescue them from consequences of their own making. And yet, they were family, the only family I had left. In the end, I decided on a middle path. I called Paul's office directly rather than the home number, suspecting he might be avoiding difficult conversations with Vanessa. "Mom?" He sounded genuinely surprised to hear from me. "Is everything all right?" "I've heard about the house," I said without preamble. "I wanted to check if you're okay." The long silence that followed told me everything. When he finally spoke, his voice was strained. "News travels fast." "Barbara Mitchell called me," I explained. "She's on the library committee with me." Another silence. Then, "It's been a difficult year. Some investments didn't pan out. The market turned against us. And Vanessa." He trailed off. "And Vanessa continued spending as though nothing had changed?" I guessed. A tired sigh. "Something like that. The settlement we paid you wasn't the cause, Mom, but it did accelerate things. We were already overextended." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and meant it. "What's your plan now?" "We don't have many options. The bank has given us 60 days. We're looking at apartments, but Vanessa is struggling with the adjustment." I could imagine. Vanessa's identity had been so thoroughly wrapped up in her address, her home, her position in that exclusive neighborhood. The loss would be devastating on multiple levels. "I have a proposal," I said carefully. "Not a bailout, but a bridge." "What do you mean?" "I know of a 2-bedroom condo near Peachtree Center. It's coming available next month. Not what you're used to, but in a respectable building with good security. I can help with the security deposit as a loan, not a gift, with clear repayment terms." The pause that followed felt weighted with recognition. that I was offering help but also establishing boundaries, that this was not an open checkbook but a specific, limited assistance. "Why would you do that?" he finally asked. "After everything?" "Because you're my son," I said simply. "And because I believe people can change when circumstances force them to reevaluate what matters." We talked for another half hour, more openly than we had in years. Paul admitted to mistakes, financial ones certainly, but also personal ones. He acknowledged that he'd allowed Vanessa's social ambitions to override his better judgment, that he'd failed to stand up for me when he should have. "I don't know if she and I will make it through this," he confessed. "The financial stress has exposed deeper problems." "Whatever happens," I told him, "you have a mother who loves you and will support you, with boundaries and expectations of mutual respect." 2 weeks later, we met for coffee at a neutral location, a small cafe halfway between my new home and his soon-to-be former one. He looked tired, the confident facade cracked to reveal the vulnerability beneath. We went over the terms of my loan offer, the expectations for repayment, the boundaries I was establishing. "This is more than I deserve," he said as he signed the agreement. "It's exactly what you deserve," I corrected him. "A chance to rebuild, but with accountability." As I walked home afterward, I reflected on the strange symmetry of our situations. A year ago, I had been the one displaced, uncertain of my future, forced to reimagine my life. Now Paul faced a similar journey. The difference was that I would be extending the hand I wished had been extended to me, not with blind forgiveness that enabled further dysfunction, but with clear-eyed compassion that allowed for growth. My new home at Magnolia Gardens welcomed me back with its now familiar warmth. As I settled into my favorite chair by the window, watching the early evening light play across the courtyard garden, I felt a profound sense of peace. The call that had changed their address had ultimately led me to find my own, not just a physical location, but a place of strength and self-respect I hadn't known I could inhabit. The salmon I prepared for dinner that night, shared with 2 new friends from my building, tasted better than any meal I'd eaten alone in that pristine kitchen. The conversation flowed easily, filled with genuine interest and respectful exchange of ideas. No one was relegated to the background. No one's presence was considered an imposition. This, I thought as laughter filled my small dining room, this is what home should feel like. A place where everyone at the table matters. The morning sun filtered through the gauzy curtains of my apartment at Magnolia Gardens, casting soft patterns across my quilt. I'd been awake for hours, a lifetime, habit that neither retirement nor upheaval had changed. This particular morning, I was preparing for a meeting I'd been anticipating for weeks, the first gathering of all 5 recipients of the Elena Johnson Nursing Graduate Fund. I smoothed my hands over the navy blue dress I'd chosen, a far cry from the muted beiges and grays that had dominated my wardrobe during those 2 stifling years in Paul and Vanessa's home. The woman in the mirror looked back at me with clear eyes and a straight spine. At 73, I had few illusions about physical aging, but there was a vibrancy in my expression now that cosmetics couldn't create, and that sadness had once erased. My phone buzzed with a text from Louisa. "Elena is so nervous about speaking today. Thank you again for this opportunity." I smiled as I typed back. "Tell her she'll be wonderful. See you both soon." The foundation had arranged for us to use their downtown conference room for the gathering, a bright, airy space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a small urban garden. When I arrived, the room was already set up with refreshments, name, tags, and presentation materials. Elena was there early, arranging folders with meticulous care. "Mrs. Johnson," she greeted me, her smile a perfect blend of confidence and deference. "Everything is ready. I hope the setup meets your expectations." "It's perfect," I assured her, taking in the thoughtful details, fresh flowers on the sign-in table, professionally printed name cards, even a small display showing photos of the recipients in their nursing school graduation regalia. "And please call me Peggy. We're colleagues now." Her posture relaxed slightly. "My mother says you're the reason she attended my graduation. That you insisted her employer give her the day off." I waved away the implicit thanks. Everyone deserves to witness the important moments in their children's lives. Your success is your mother's success, too. "She works for a good family now," Elena said, arranging a stack of brochures. "They know her name. Ask about me. It's different." I nodded, thinking about how often dignity comes disguised as simple recognition. Being seen, being named, being acknowledged as a person, with connections and a life beyond service to others. Lessons I'd learned painfully late in my own journey. The other recipients arrived soon after. Thomas, whose parents had immigrated from Guatemala when he was a child. Aisha, who had worked night shifts as a hospital aide while completing her nursing degree. Darius, a former Army medic transitioning to civilian healthcare, and Janelle, who had postponed her education to raise her younger siblings after their parents died. Each carried stories of determination that made my own struggles seem modest by comparison. After introductions and refreshments, we moved to the main purpose of our gathering, finalizing the specific allocations for each grant. The fund wasn't merely providing money, it was offering targeted support for the practical hurdles faced by new nursing graduates from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. The average apartment security deposit in Atlanta is $1,800, Elena explained as she led the discussion, having researched the topic thoroughly. Plus, first month's rent? That's over $3,500 just to get your foot in the door of housing. For new graduates who haven't received their first paycheck, who may have student loans coming due, this timing gap can be devastating. Thomas nodded emphatically. "I'm living with 3 roommates an hour from the hospital. The commute is eating into my sleep schedule, which isn't safe for my patients or me." "And professional wardrobe costs," added Aisha. "Scrubs are provided at work, but we need appropriate clothes for interviews, administrative days, community outreach. It adds up quickly." We spent 2 hours discussing these practical challenges and adjusting the grant allocations accordingly. Housing deposits, transportation assistance, professional attire, licensing exam fees, even initial childcare costs for Janelle, who was a single mother. By the end, each recipient had a tailored support package of approximately $10,000, designed to bridge the gap between graduation and financial stability. As we were wrapping up, Darius cleared his throat. Peggy," he began, his deep voice unexpectedly hesitant. "We've all been wondering. Why did you create this fund? Most scholarships focus on tuition, not what happens after graduation. What made you think of this specific need?" The question caught me off guard, though it was perfectly reasonable. I hadn't prepared to share my personal story, hadn't framed my actions as anything beyond practical philanthropy. But looking at these 5 remarkable young people, I felt they deserved honesty. "I lived most of my life believing I had little power," I said slowly. "I was a teacher for 40 years, a wife, a mother. I did what was expected. When my husband died and I moved in with my son and his wife, I slowly allowed myself to become invisible in their home. I ate in the kitchen during their dinner parties. I stored my belongings in boxes. I made myself small to avoid being an inconvenience." The room had gone very quiet. Elena's eyes, so like her mother's, watched me with growing understanding. When I finally stood up for myself, when I reclaimed my financial and personal independence, I discovered that visibility, being seen, respected, having agency, changes everything. This fund isn't just about money. It's about removing the practical barriers that might force any of you to accept situations where you're undervalued, where your dignity is compromised. Janelle nodded slowly. "I almost took a position at a clinic that wanted me to work unpaid training shifts for the first month, because I was desperate for anything close to my children's daycare. If it weren't for this grant, I might have had no choice. Exactly, I said. Choices are power, and everyone deserves that power, especially those who've worked as hard as you have. After the meeting concluded, I found myself lingering in the conference room, straightening chairs that didn't need straightening, gathering papers that were already neatly stacked. The emotional expenditure of sharing even that small part of my story had left me unexpectedly drained. Mrs. Johnson? Louisa's voice came from the doorway. She had arrived to pick up Elena, who was saying goodbye to the other recipients in the hallway. May I speak with you? Of course, I said, gesturing to a chair nearby. And please, after all we've been through, call me Peggy. She sat with characteristic grace, smoothing her dress with hands that showed the evidence of years of domestic labor. I wanted to thank you privately. What you've done for Elena. She paused, collecting herself. It's more than the money. It's showing her that women like us matter. Women like us? I echoed. Women who have been invisible, she said simply. You in that big house, me in all the houses where I've worked, different circumstances, same experience. The insight struck me with surprising force. I'd never fully articulated the connection, yet Louisa had captured it perfectly. We had both been rendered invisible, me by family, who should have valued me, her by employers who had reduced her to her function, rather than recognizing her humanity. There's something else, she continued, her voice lowering slightly. I thought you should know about your son and his wife. My breath caught. What about them? They are separated now, Louisa said. Mr. Paul is living in the condo you helped with. Mrs. Vanessa moved to her sister's house in Tennessee last month. The divorce papers have been filed. I absorbed this information slowly. The collapse of their marriage wasn't entirely surprising, given the financial pressures and the fault lines that had been evident even when I lived with them. Still, it represented another layer of change, another shifting of the landscape I'd once taken for granted. How do you know this? I asked. Elena's friend works as a receptionist at the law firm handling the divorce, Louisa explained. And, she hesitated, Mr. Paul came to our apartment last week. He wanted to apologize to me in person for how Mrs. Vanessa had treated me. He said he was trying to make amends to people he had allowed to be mistreated. This information was more startling than the news of the divorce. Paul, voluntarily seeking out Louisa to apologize? The son who had watched me eat alone in the kitchen without protest was now acknowledging his complicity in mistreating others? Did he seem sincere? I asked. Louisa nodded. Very. He spoke differently. More like the young man I remember from when you first moved to Atlanta. Less. What is the word? Artificial. I thanked her for sharing this information, my mind already processing the implications. We walked out together, watching Elena chat animatedly with her fellow grant recipients. The sight reinforced what I'd begun to understand more deeply. The ripple effects of standing up for one's own dignity extend far beyond personal satisfaction. My small act of rebellion had not only changed my life, but was now touching others in ways I couldn't have anticipated. That evening, alone in my apartment, I contemplated whether to reach out to Paul. We had maintained a cautious, limited communication since I'd helped him with the condo deposit, occasional texts, a brief coffee meeting once a month. I'd been careful not to press for more, sensitive to the humiliation he must feel at his reduced circumstances and aware that genuine reconciliation couldn't be rushed. The next morning, I decided to take a walk through Piedmont Park, one of Atlanta's urban sanctuaries that I'd come to love in my new independent life. The spring day was glorious, dogwoods and azaleas in full bloom, the air sweet with the scent of magnolias. I found myself wandering toward the small lake at the park's center, drawn to the tranquility of the water, As I rounded the path near the boathouse, I stopped short. Sitting on a bench overlooking the lake was Paul, alone, staring out at the water. He was dressed casually in jeans and a faded university sweatshirt, clothing I hadn't seen him wear in years, since Vanessa had deemed such attire too collegiate for a financial professional. For a moment, I considered turning away, respecting what appeared to be a private moment. But something in his posture, a weariness, a vulnerability, made me approach instead. "Is this seat taken?" I asked quietly. He looked up, startled, then a small smile crept across his face. "Mom, what are you doing here?" "Same as you, I imagine," I said, settling beside him. "Enjoying the spring weather. May I join you?" He nodded, shifting slightly to make room. We sat in silence for several minutes, watching a family of ducks navigate the still waters of the lake. "Louisa told me about you and Vanessa," I said finally. "I'm sorry about the divorce." He gave a small, rueful laugh. "Are you really?" The question wasn't confrontational, just genuinely curious. I considered my answer carefully. "I'm sorry for your pain," I said honestly. "Marriage ending is always difficult, no matter the circumstances. But am I sorry the relationship ended? I can't say that I am, given what I observed between you." He nodded slowly. "That's fair. More than fair, actually." He picked up a small stone from beside the bench and turned it over in his hands. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately. About choices. About what I allowed to happen in our home." I waited, giving him space to continue in his own time. "When Dad died, something shifted in me," he said eventually. "I'd always measured myself against him, his integrity, his commitment to service, his contentment with a modest life well lived. I never quite matched up, but I tried. Then he was gone, and suddenly Vanessa's values filled that vacuum. Status, appearances, climbing higher on some social ladder that never actually ended." "Why her values and not yours?" I asked gently. He considered this. "Maybe because hers were clearer, definable. Get the promotion, buy the bigger house, join the takur, right clubs. Dad's values, your values, were always more abstract. Kindness, integrity, seeing people as people, not as assets or liabilities." I nodded, understanding. In a world that constantly quantifies success in dollars and square footage, more intangible, values can seem insubstantial, especially to someone grieving and vulnerable. "I let myself become someone I didn't recognize," he continued. "Someone who could watch his own mother eat alone in the kitchen and convince himself it was normal, acceptable." He looked at me directly then, his eyes damp. "I am so deeply sorry, Mom, not just for specific incidents, but for the entire environment I allowed to develop, for failing to protect your dignity in our home." The apology, so straightforward and unqualified, caught me off guard. I had imagined this conversation many times, but always with me needing to explain why I'd been hurt, having to justify my feelings. To be met instead with such clear acknowledgement was disarming. "Thank you," I said simply. "That means a great deal to me." "I visited Louisa last week," he said, returning his gaze to the lake. It was humbling. She welcomed me into her home, a home much smaller than ours had been, but so much warmer. Offered me coffee, showed me photos of Elena's graduation, treated me with more grace than I deserved. "She mentioned you'd stopped by," I acknowledged. That was a meaningful gesture. "It's the least I could do. I've started making a list, actually. People I need to apologize to, things I need to make right, if possible." He gave a small, self-deprecating laugh. "It's a depressingly long list." We sat together for nearly an hour, the conversation flowing more naturally than it had in years. He told me about his new job at a smaller, more ethically focused investment firm, Lower salary but better aligned with the values he was trying to reclaim. About the divorce proceedings, which Vanessa was making predictably complicated. About the modest condo where he now lived, which was gradually beginning to feel like a home rather than just a fallback accommodation. "Would you like to come over? For dinner sometime?" he asked as we finally rose to continue our separate walks. "Nothing fancy. My cooking skills are remedial at best, but I make a decent pasta." "I'd like that," I said, surprised by how much I meant it. 3 days later, I stood outside his condo door, a bottle of wine in one hand and a homemade apple pie in the other. The building was pleasant but unremarkable, clean, well-maintained, but lacking the ostentatious flourishes of his former home. When he opened the door, the contrast with his past life was even more apparent. Gone were the designer clothes and carefully maintained hairstyle. This Paul wore a casual button-down shirt with sleeves rolled up, his hair slightly rumpled, his expression open and unguarded. "Mom, come in," he said, stepping aside to welcome me. "Sorry about the mess. I'm still figuring out where everything goes." The space was indeed somewhat disorganized, moving boxes still stacked in corners, furniture arranged in a functional but not particularly aesthetic manner. But there were touches that spoke of genuine effort. Fresh flowers on the dining table, family photos displayed prominently on a bookshelf, including several of me and Robert that had been conspicuously absent in the Buckhead house. "It's coming along nicely," I said, handing him the wine and moving toward the kitchen with the pie. "Where shall I put this?" "Anywhere there's space," he laughed. "The kitchen organization system is best described as chaos theory at the moment." We settled into an evening that felt both novel and strangely familiar, as though we were reconnecting with a rhythm from the distant past. Paul's pasta was indeed decent, if simple. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by comfortable silences that no longer felt fraught with unspoken tensions. He asked about my life at Magnolia Gardens, listening attentively to stories about my new friends and activities. I found myself sharing more than I'd initially planned: the book club discussions, the weekend excursions to local museums, the volunteer work that now filled my days with purpose. "You seem happy," he observed as we lingered over coffee, and "I've been more yourself somehow." "I am," I agreed. It's strange how finding the courage to stand up for yourself clarifies everything else. Once I stopped accepting being invisible in your home, I realized how many other aspects of my life needed reclaiming. He winced slightly at the reference, but didn't deflect. "I've been reading Dad's journals," he said, changing the subject slightly. "Found them when I was packing up. Did you know he kept them?" I nodded. "Every day for 40 years. He said it helped him process his thoughts, track his growth." "There's so much wisdom in them," Paul said softly. "About teaching, about parenting, about marriage. Things I wish I'd asked him while he was still here." He hesitated, then added, "He wrote about you constantly, with such admiration and love." I felt my throat tighten. We had a true partnership, not perfect but equal. We saw each other. "That's what was missing with Vanessa and me," he acknowledged. "We never really saw each other, just reflections of what we wanted the other to be." As I prepared to leave that evening, Paul handed me a small package wrapped in simple brown paper. "This is for you," he said. "I found it when I was going through some things at the storage unit. Thought, you might want it back." At home, I unwrapped the package carefully. Inside was a small wooden box I recognized immediately. Robert's handiwork, a gift he'd made for me on our 20th anniversary. I'd thought it lost in the move to Paul's house. Opening it, I found the contents intact. The collection of small mementos I'd kept from our years together. Ticket stubs from our first date, the hospital bracelet from when Paul was born, pressed flowers from anniversary bouquets, small notes Robert had hidden in my lunch bag during busy teaching days. The rediscovery of these treasures affected me more deeply than I expected. I sat on my sofa late into the night, each small item a thread reconnecting me to the tapestry of my past. Not just to Robert, though his presence was woven through everything, but to my own history, the woman I had been through different phases of life, the values that had guided me, the love that had sustained me. The following week brought another development in my evolving relationship with Paul. He called on Tuesday evening, his voice animated in a way I hadn't heard in years. "Mom, I have a proposition for you," he began. "Remember how you mentioned, the garden club at Magnolia Gardens needs a new greenhouse, but the funding got cut from the community budget?" "Yes," I said, surprised he'd retained this detail from one of our recent conversations. "It wasn't considered essential." "Well, I may have a solution. The investment firm I'm working with now has a community support initiative. They match employee contributions to local projects, not just money, but volunteer hours as well. I've already spoken to my supervisor, and they're interested in potentially sponsoring the greenhouse as part of our environmental sustainability program." I was momentarily speechless. This thoughtful initiative was so far removed from the Paul who had existed in Vanessa's orbit, focused exclusively on prestige and personal advancement. "That would be wonderful," I managed finally. The garden club would be thrilled. "There's more," he continued. "Part of the project involves community education. We were hoping some of the residents might be willing to host gardening workshops for local school children. I remembered you mentioning several master gardeners live at Magnolia Gardens, including me," I reminded him with a smile in my voice. "I didn't spend 40 years tending that garden at our old house for nothing." "Exactly!" His enthusiasm was palpable. "Would you be the liaison for this? Help coordinate between our team and the residents? It would mean working together on something meaningful." The proposal touched me deeply, not just the practical benefit to my community, but the implicit recognition of my expertise, my connections, my ability to contribute meaningfully to a project. It represented exactly the kind of acknowledgement I had craved during those invisible years in his home. "I'd be honored," I said simply. The greenhouse project quickly became a focal point of my weekly routine. Planning meetings at Paul's office, site assessments with the construction team, coordination with the garden club members. Throughout it all, I watched my son rediscovering aspects of himself that had been submerged during his marriage to Vanessa. His natural leadership abilities now channeled toward community benefit rather than status acquisition. His genuine interest in environmental sustainability, his capacity for listening to and valuing diverse perspectives. During one planning session at Magnolia Gardens, as garden club members enthusiastically discussed design preferences for the greenhouse, I stepped back to observe the scene. Paul sat in the midst of a circle of seniors, many in their 80s, taking detailed notes as they debated the merits of different irrigation systems. His attention was focused, respectful, genuinely interested. Not the forced patience of someone humoring the elderly, but the authentic engagement of someone who recognized the value of their expertise. Dorothy, our 92-year-old orchid specialist who rarely offered compliments, approached me during a break. "That son of yours," she said, her voice gruff with decades of cigarettes despite having quit 20 years ago. "He actually listens. Not many young folks do that anymore." "He's relearning some important lessons," I replied, watching as Paul earnestly discussed composting techniques with Mr. Abernathy, our resident organic gardening guru. "Well, whatever caused the lesson," Dorothy observed shrewdly, "it seems to be taking root." The greenhouse was completed in early autumn, a beautiful structure of glass and sustainable materials that captured the morning light perfectly. The dedication ceremony brought together residents, local school children, and representatives from Paul's firm. I stood somewhat apart, watching as Paul gave a brief speech thanking everyone involved, making sure to name and acknowledge each garden club member who had contributed expertise. None of this would have been possible without the knowledge and guidance of Magnolia Gardens' remarkable residents, he said, his gaze finding mine across the gathered crowd. Especially my mother, Margaret Johnson, who taught me, sometimes, the hard way, that wisdom doesn't diminish with age, and that everyone deserves to be seen and heard. The simple public acknowledgement brought tears to my eyes, not because I needed the recognition, but because it represented something profound. My son had truly understood the lesson at the heart of our painful journey. He had learned to see people, not just me, but Louisa, the garden club members, his new colleagues, as full human beings deserving of dignity and respect. Later, as we walked through the new greenhouse admiring the initial plantings, Paul turned to me with an expression of quiet contentment. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "You did all the work coordinating with your firm." "For not giving up on me," he clarified. "For making that difficult phone call that changed everything. If you hadn't stood up for yourself, I might never have recognized what I was becoming." I reached out and squeezed his hand, the truth of his words settling between us. That single call, made in desperation after another dinner eaten alone in the kitchen, had indeed changed everything. But the real transformation had come afterward, in the courage to maintain boundaries, to expect respect, to rebuild a relationship based on mutual recognition rather than obligation or dependence. As we continued our tour, stopping to admire Mr. Abernathy's heirloom tomato seedlings, I reflected on how far we'd both come from that cold night in Paul and Vanessa's kitchen. The journey had been painful, the losses real. But standing here now, watching my son engage thoughtfully with my community, I felt the fullness of what had been gained. Not just my own dignity and independence, but the restoration of authentic connection with the child I had once feared was lost to me forever. The seeds we were planting in this greenhouse would bear fruit for seasons to come, but the seeds of respect and recognition we'd planted in our relationship were already yielding a harvest more nourishing than I could have imagined on that night, when I finally found the courage to make one call that changed everything. The Elena Johnson Nursing Graduate Fund was celebrating its first anniversary, and I found myself standing at a podium I hadn't anticipated, addressing a room full of people who had come together to mark the occasion. What had begun as a modest initiative born from my own experience of invisibility had grown beyond my expectations. The foundation that administered the fund had invited healthcare leaders, potential donors, and of course, all our grant recipients, to this celebratory event. "When I established this fund," I began, my voice steadier than I'd expected, "I thought I was creating something small and specific, a practical solution to a gap I'd observed. What I've discovered is that dignity isn't just about grand gestures. It's found in the details. Having appropriate clothes for a job interview, affording an apartment near your workplace, being able to pay for childcare while you build your career." I glanced around the room, noting Elena's proud smile, Louisa's quiet tears, and, somewhat surprisingly, Paul sitting in the back row, attentive and supportive. His presence represented yet another step in our healing journey, one I had once thought impossible. "In just 1 year, we've supported 15 new nursing graduates," I continued. "Every one of them is now employed in a healthcare setting, providing essential care to our community. None has had to compromise their professional goals due to financial pressures. And perhaps most importantly, each has maintained the dignity that comes with true independence." The applause that followed felt like validation, not just of the fund's work, but of the difficult path that had led me here. From that cold kitchen island to this moment of purpose and connection. As I stepped away from the podium, the foundation director announced a surprise. In recognition of the fund's success, they were matching my initial endowment, effectively doubling our capacity for the coming year. The reception afterward was lively, with grant recipients mingling with potential donors and healthcare administrators. I found myself engaged in conversations about expanding the program, possibly creating similar supports for other healthcare professions. In the midst of this discussion, I felt a gentle touch on my elbow. Sorry to interrupt, Mom, Paul said, but there's someone I'd like you to meet. He guided me toward a distinguished-looking woman in her 60s, her silver hair cut in a stylish bob, her posture suggesting both authority and approachability. Mom, this is Dr. Catherine Martinez, Chief of Nursing at Emory University Hospital. Dr. Martinez, my mother, Margaret Johnson. It's a pleasure, Dr. Martinez said, extending her hand. Your son has told me about your innovative approach to supporting new nurses. We've been trying to improve retention rates for years, and housing instability is one of the biggest challenges our new hires face. The conversation that followed opened yet another unexpected door. Dr. Martinez was interested in creating a formal partnership between the hospital and the Elena Johnson Fund, a pipeline program that would provide both financial support and guaranteed job placement for promising nursing students from disadvantaged backgrounds. We'd want you to be personally involved in the selection committee, she told me. Your insight into the practical barriers these students face would be invaluable. I glanced at Paul, surprised. You arranged this introduction? He shook his head, smiling. I just mentioned the fund during a meeting where nursing retention was being discussed. Dr. Martinez sought me out afterward. Your reputation precedes you now, Mom. The idea that I might have a reputation beyond Paul's mother or Robert's widow was still new enough to startle me. For so many years, I had defined myself primarily through my relationships to others, as mother, wife, daughter-in-law. The notion that my own initiatives, my own vision might be recognized independently was both exhilarating and slightly disorienting. As the evening wound down, Paul offered to drive me home. The autumn night was crisp, the Atlanta skyline glittering against the darkness as we traveled from downtown toward Magnolia Gardens. You were impressive tonight, he said, breaking the comfortable silence between us. I don't think I fully understood what you were building until I saw all those people gathered together, all those lives changed. It still surprises me sometimes, I admitted. When I made that first call to Nathan Phillips, I was just trying to protect myself, to stop being erased in your home. I never imagined where it would lead. Paul's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. I keep thinking about that, how something that felt like a personal attack at the time was actually the beginning of something better for everyone. Even me. I studied his profile in the intermittent glow of streetlights. The past year had changed him physically as well as emotionally. The perpetual tension that had marked his expression during the later years with Vanessa had eased. He looked younger somehow, more like the boy I remembered. How are you doing, really? I asked, with the divorce finalized and everything. He considered the question carefully before answering. Better than I expected. There's sadness of course. No one marries expecting it to end. But there's also relief. He paused at a red light, turning slightly to face me. I don't think I realized how exhausting it was, constantly managing appearances, always worried about saying or doing the wrong thing. The light changed, and he returned his attention to the road. The condo feels like home now. I'm dating someone, actually, taking it very slowly. She's a librarian at the public library downtown. We met during the greenhouse project. A librarian? I couldn't help the note of surprise in my voice. Vanessa had been so dramatically different. Ambitious, status-conscious, always calculating social advantage. Paul laughed softly. I know. Claire is nothing like Vanessa. She reads voraciously, volunteers teaching adult literacy, wears sensible shoes, and doesn't own a single designer handbag. Dad would have loved her. The casual mention of Robert, natural and unforced, warmed me. For so long after his death, Paul had avoided speaking of his father, as though the grief were too raw or the comparisons too unflattering to himself. I'd like to meet her sometime, I said. I'd like that too. Maybe dinner next week? Nothing formal. Claire's not big on formality. As we pulled up to Magnolia Gardens, I noticed the newly completed greenhouse glowing softly in the darkness, its glass panes reflecting the security lights. The project had evolved beyond its initial scope, becoming a true community resource, with educational programs for local schools and a partnership with a nearby food bank that received our excess produce. "Will you come to the Harvest Festival next month?" I asked as he walked me to my door. "The garden club is showcasing everything we've grown in the new space. There's quite a bit of pride involved." "Wouldn't miss it," he promised. Claire and I both signed up to help with the children's planting activity, if that's all right with you. The casual way he integrated his new relationship into his community commitments spoke volumes about the changes in his life. This wasn't the Paul who had once calculated every social interaction for maximum advantage. "More than all right," I assured him. "I'll look forward to meeting her." Inside my apartment, I found myself too energized to sleep despite the late hour. The evening had been full of meaningful connections, with the grant recipients, with Dr. Martinez, with Paul. Each relationship represented a different facet of the life I was building, a life defined by purpose and mutual respect rather than obligation or dependence. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and settled in my favorite chair by the window, gazing out at the quiet community grounds. The past year had brought changes I couldn't have imagined when I first made that desperate call to Nathan Phillips. From the pain of being marginalized in my son's home had come a cascade of positive developments, not just for me, but for others as well. The next morning, I woke to an email from Dr. Martinez, outlining her proposal for the partnership between Emory Hospital and the Elena Johnson Fund. The scope was ambitious, a comprehensive program that would identify promising nursing students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds in their junior year, provide financial and mentoring support through graduation, and guarantee employment placement with additional transition assistance for housing and professional development. "We would like you to chair the selection committee," Dr. Martinez wrote. "Your perspective and experience are exactly what we need to make this program successful." The request was flattering, but also somewhat daunting. This would be a significant commitment, far beyond the occasional meetings and events I currently attended for the fund. It would mean re-entering the professional world in a capacity I hadn't occupied in years, as a decision-maker, a program, architect, someone with meaningful authority. I was still contemplating this opportunity when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Luisa's name. "Peggy," she greeted me, her voice unusually animated. "Have you seen the news about Mrs. Vanessa?" "No," I said, instantly alert. "What's happened?" "She has been arrested," Luisa said, a note of disbelief in her voice. "In Tennessee, for fraud. It's on the local news website." After our call ended, I quickly found the article online. The story was brief, but detailed. Vanessa Carter, recently divorced and now going by her maiden name, had been charged with multiple counts of financial fraud related to charitable organizations she had established in Knoxville. According to the report, she had been diverting funds from donations intended for children's education programs into personal accounts. The news was shocking, but not entirely surprising. Vanessa's elaborate charity events in Atlanta had always seemed more focused on social prestige than actual impact. I had sometimes wondered about the discrepancy between the large sums supposedly raised and the modest results reported, but had attributed it to inefficiency rather than deliberate fraud. I debated whether to contact Paul. On one hand, this was no longer his problem. The divorce was final, their lives separate. On the other hand, the public nature of the scandal would inevitably affect him, possibly even professionally given his role in the financial sector. Before I could decide, my phone rang again. Paul's name appeared on the screen. "I guess you've heard," he said without preamble when I answered. "Just now, from Luisa," I confirmed. "Are you all right?" He sighed heavily. "Yes and no. It's complicated. I'm not entirely surprised, which is perhaps the worst part. There were always discrepancies in her charity accounts that she explained away. I chose to believe her because the alternative was too ugly to consider. This isn't your responsibility anymore, I reminded him gently. Maybe not legally, he agreed, but there's still a sense of, I don't know, failure? That I was so blinded by her that I might have enabled this to happen. We can't control the actions of others, I said, only how we respond to them. That's very wise and very generous, he replied, a hint of rueful humor in his voice. But I think I need to do something more concrete. I'm meeting with my attorney this afternoon to discuss whether I have any legal obligation to the charities she defrauded during our marriage. Even if I don't, I'm considering making personal donations to help offset what was stolen. His response revealed how fundamentally his values had realigned over the past year. The Paul who had stood by while I ate alone in the kitchen would never have voluntarily taken on financial responsibility for someone else's misdeeds, particularly not an ex-spouse's. That's a very honorable approach, I told him. Robert would be proud. I hope so, he said quietly. I'm trying to make choices he would respect. After we hung up, I returned to Dr. Martinez's email, my perspective subtly shifted by the conversation with Paul. The proposed partnership represented an opportunity to extend the impact of what I'd started, to create something enduring that would support generations of new healthcare professionals. It was also a chance to use my hard-won wisdom about dignity and visibility to shape an institutional program. I wrote back accepting the position, suggesting we meet the following week to begin developing the framework for the selection process. As I sent the email, I felt a familiar blend of excitement and trepidation, the same emotions that had accompanied every significant new chapter in my life, from beginning my teaching career to confronting the situation in Paul's home. The Harvest Festival at Magnolia Gardens arrived on a perfect October day. Crisp air, brilliant blue sky, the trees beginning to show hints of autumn color. The greenhouse and surrounding garden plots had been transformed with decorative touches created by the residents. Corn husk dolls, dried flower arrangements, hand-painted signs identifying the various vegetables and herbs we had cultivated. Children from local schools arrived in small groups throughout the morning, wide-eyed at the bounty produced in our urban garden. Each child had the opportunity to harvest something for the community food bank donation, then plant a seedling to take home. The garden club members, many in their 80s and 90s, guided these activities with surprising energy, clearly delighted by the children's enthusiasm. I spotted Paul and Claire at the planting station, helping a group of kindergartners press tiny lettuce seedlings into small biodegradable pots. Claire was exactly as Paul had described her, thoughtful, unpretentious, with an easy manner that put the children instantly at ease. Her gray-streaked brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, her clothing practical and comfortable. She looked entirely at home in the garden setting, laughing as one enthusiastic 5-year-old managed to splash soil onto her shirt. I approached as they were finishing with the group, waiting until the children had moved on to the next activity before introducing myself. You must be Claire, I said, extending my hand. I'm Margaret Johnson, Paul's mother. Peggy, she corrected with a warm smile, taking my hand in both of hers. Paul always calls you Peggy now. It's wonderful to finally meet you. This greenhouse project is remarkable. I've been hearing about it for months. There was something immediately likable about her directness, her complete lack of artifice. I could see why Paul had been drawn to her after the exhausting performance that had characterized his relationship with Vanessa. Paul mentioned you're a librarian, I said as we walked together toward the refreshment area, Paul having been waylaid by Mr. Abernathy to discuss the tomato varieties. Adult literacy specialist, technically, she clarified. I work with adults who are learning to read or improving their reading skills. Many are immigrants. Others are people who fell through the cracks in the education system. That must be rewarding work, I observed. It is, though not in ways most people expect, she replied thoughtfully. Everyone assumes the reward is in seeing someone read their first book or get a better job, and those moments are certainly meaningful. But for me, the real reward is witnessing the change in how people carry themselves once they have access to information that was previously inaccessible. There's a dignity that comes with that independence. Her words resonated deeply with my own experience. Dignity and independence go hand in hand, I agreed. One can't exist fully without the other. She nodded, her expression indicating she understood the depth behind my simple statement. Paul told me about what happened, she said quietly. About the kitchen, about standing up for yourself. It took courage. I was momentarily startled by her knowledge of such a personal matter, then realized it was actually a positive sign. That Paul had shared this difficult chapter with her suggested a level of honesty and reflection in their relationship that had been absent with Vanessa. It wasn't courage so much as desperation, I admitted. Sometimes we don't know what we're capable of until we have no other choice. That's exactly what I tell my adult students, she said with a smile. Courage isn't about feeling brave, it's about doing what needs to be done despite being afraid. Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of several garden club members, eager to introduce themselves to Paul's new partner. I stepped back, watching with quiet satisfaction as Claire engaged easily with my friends, showing genuine interest in their gardening expertise and community activities. Paul joined me, handing me a cup of the apple cider being served from a large silver urn. So, what do you think? He asked, his eyes following Claire as she listened intently to Dorothy's detailed explanation of orchid propagation. I think she's lovely, I said honestly. Genuine, thoughtful, very different from... I caught myself before mentioning Vanessa's name, uncertain if that comparison would be welcome. Very different from Vanessa, he finished for me, seeming unbothered by the contrast. That's what drew me to her initially. The complete absence of calculation in how she interacts with people. She values them for themselves, not for what they can offer her. The festival continued through the afternoon, a steady stream of community members, touring the greenhouse, children planting seedlings, and everyone enjoying the harvest-themed refreshments. As the day wound down, I found myself sitting with Dorothy and Mr. Abernathy at a small table near the edge of the garden, watching the activity with contented fatigue. Your son seems happy, Dorothy observed, her sharp eyes missing nothing. And that woman of his, she's got substance, not like the other one, all shine and no depth. Claire is a good match for him, I agreed. She reminds him of who he really is, I think. Mr. Abernathy, never one for relationship discussions, steered the conversation back to his preferred topic. We should expand the greenhouse program. Next spring, he declared, add a section for exotic vegetables. I've got seeds for Japanese eggplants and Thai chilies. Always thinking ahead, aren't you, James? Dorothy teased him. Some of us are just trying to get through the winter. Their gentle bickering, familiar after months of garden club collaboration, washed over me as I contemplated the scene before me. Children planting seeds they would nurture at home. Elderly residents sharing knowledge accumulated over decades. Paul and Claire, heads bent together over a display of herb seedlings, building something new based on shared values rather than social ambition. All of it had grown from that difficult moment of standing up for myself, of refusing to accept invisibility any longer. The painful conversation with Paul, the legal negotiations, the separation from a household where I'd never truly belonged. Each challenging step had led to this flourishing community, these authentic connections. Later that evening, Paul, Claire, and I had dinner at my apartment, a simple meal of harvest vegetable soup and freshly baked bread, ingredients largely sourced from our greenhouse. The conversation flowed easily, ranging from Claire's literacy work to the ongoing partnership with Emory Hospital, to Paul's efforts to make restitution for Vanessa's charitable fraud. The legal proceedings are still ongoing, he explained, But I've already made donations to cover what we can prove was misappropriated during our marriage. It's the right thing to do, even though my attorney keeps reminding me I have no legal obligation. That can't be easy financially, I observed, knowing that his current position paid considerably less than his previous one. He shrugged. I'm adjusting my expectations. Downsizing felt like deprivation at first, but now it's mostly relief. There's a freedom in simplicity that I never appreciated before. Claire reached over and squeezed his hand, a small gesture of support. Tell your mother about the community finance workshops, she encouraged. Paul smiled, a hint of his old confidence returning, but tempered now with humility. I've started offering free financial literacy workshops at Claire's library, he explained. Basic budgeting, understanding credit, planning for retirement, practical skills for people who haven't had access to that kind of information. It's a way of using my professional background for something more meaningful than just accumulating wealth. It's been remarkably successful, Claire added. We've had to add additional sessions to meet the demand. Turns out financial knowledge is just as empowering as literacy. They go hand in hand, really. As they shared stories about the people they'd met through these workshops, immigrants saving to bring family members to the United States, young parents working to buy their first homes, seniors learning to manage fixed incomes, I was struck by how organically their individual passions had aligned toward a common purpose. There was nothing calculated or performative about their community involvement, unlike the carefully curated charitable activities that had characterized Paul and Vanessa's relationship. When they left that night, Paul hugged me at the door, a real embrace, not the perfunctory gesture that had become our norm during his marriage to Vanessa. Thank you, he whispered, and I knew he meant for more than just dinner. Alone in my apartment afterward, I sat by the window looking out at the community gardens illuminated by strategic lighting. The greenhouse stood at its center, glass panes, reflecting the night sky, a structure that represented not just horticultural ambition, but a reclamation of values, a restoration of connections. I thought about the Elena Johnson Fund, now expanding through the partnership with Emory Hospital, about Paul and Claire, building a relationship based on substance rather than appearance, about the garden club members sharing their wisdom with a new generation. All of these flourishing initiatives had grown from what had initially felt like an ending, that painful moment when I finally acknowledged my invisibility in my son's home and decided it was unacceptable. The next morning, I had an early meeting with Dr. Martinez to continue planning the expanded scholarship program. As I prepared to leave, I caught sight of myself in the mirror by the door. No longer the diminished woman who had eaten alone, in her son's kitchen, but someone who stood straight, who met her own gaze with confidence, who had remembered what it meant to occupy space in the world without apology. That single call to Nathan Phillips had indeed changed an address. Not just Paul and Vanessa's physical location, but the metaphorical address of my own life. I had moved from the margins to the center of my own story, from invisibility to full presence. And in doing so, I had created ripples that continued to expand outward, touching lives beyond my own in ways I could never have anticipated when I first found the courage to say, enough. I picked up my briefcase, straightened my shoulders, and stepped out into the morning light, ready for whatever the day might bring. The journey that had begun with that one defiant phone call was far from over. It was, in many ways, just beginning. Winter settled over Atlanta with unusual intensity that year, bringing rare snowfalls that transformed Magnolia Gardens into a wonderland of white-dusted pines and crystalline pathways. I had always found a certain peace in winter, the quiet, contemplation it encouraged, the way it stripped everything down to essentials. This particular December morning, I stood in the greenhouse among thriving plants that defied the season, a cup of steaming tea warming my hands as I inspected the early lettuce seedlings. "There you are," came Dorothy's voice from the doorway. "Thought I might find you hiding out in here." At 93, she moved more slowly than she once had, but her mind remained razor-sharp, her observations unfailingly perceptive. Not hiding, I corrected mildly. Just checking on the seedlings before the selection committee meeting. Nervous? She asked, settling onto the bench we'd placed near the tomato beds. I considered her question thoughtfully. Not nervous. Exactly. More. Aware of responsibility. These decisions will affect young people's entire careers, their lives. The expanded Elena Johnson Nursing Graduate Fund was now in its second year, its partnership with Emory Hospital having transformed it from a modest support system into a comprehensive pipeline program. As chair of the selection committee, I reviewed applications from promising nursing students across Georgia, identifying those who showed not just academic potential, but the resilience and commitment that healthcare desperately needed. You'll make the right choices, Dorothy said with characteristic certainty. You've lived enough to recognize authentic determination when you see it. I smiled at her confidence in me, finishing my tea as we sat in companionable silence among the growing things. My phone buzzed with a text from Paul. Picking you up at 4 for the ceremony. Claire finished the cookies. Ridiculous quantity as usual. Don't eat lunch. The nursing school graduation ceremony was that afternoon, a small, mid-year cohort that included 2 of our scholarship recipients. I'd been invited to offer brief remarks, something that would have terrified me 2 years ago, but now felt like a natural extension of my work with the fund. Your son still coming for Christmas? Dorothy asked as we made our way back toward the main building, moving carefully along salted pathways. Yes, he and Claire both. We're doing Christmas Eve here, then going to Claire's sister's house for Christmas Day, first family holiday in years. Dorothy nodded approvingly. Good, family's what matters in the end, not the fancy address or the status dinners. Just having people who see you clearly and love you anyway. Her simple wisdom echoed in my mind as I prepared for the selection committee meeting. The large conference room overlooked the winter garden, now transformed by snow. Around the table sat representatives from Emory Hospital, nursing faculty, from 2 local universities, and 3 former grant recipients who now served as program mentors. This diverse group ensured our selections were based on multiple perspectives, not just academic achievements. Before we begin reviewing applications, I said as the meeting commenced, I'd like to remind us all of our core mission. We're not simply seeking students with perfect grades or impressive resumes. We're looking for individuals who understand the fundamental dignity of healthcare work, seeing patients as whole people, recognizing what it means to be vulnerable, bringing compassion alongside technical skill. Dr. Martinez nodded her agreement. Exactly right, Peggy. Technical skills can be taught. The ability to truly see patients as people is much harder to instill. We spent 3 hours carefully reviewing applications, discussing each candidate's unique circumstances, strengths, and potential contributions to the healthcare community. The conversations were thoughtful, sometimes passionate, but always focused on our shared purpose. Identifying promising nurses who needed precisely the support our program offered to flourish. By the time we adjourned, we had selected 15 new recipients who would begin receiving support in their final semester, continuing through their first year of professional practice. Each would be paired with a mentor, guaranteed a position at Emory or an affiliated facility, and provided with housing assistance during the critical transition period between graduation and financial stability. As the others gathered their materials to leave, Dr. Martinez lingered. I've been meaning to ask you something, Peggy, she said once we were alone. We're developing a new patient dignity initiative at Emory, reimagining how we approach everything from hospital gowns to communication protocols. The goal is to preserve patients' sense of autonomy and self-worth, even in institutional settings. I'd like you to consider joining the advisory committee. I must have looked surprised because she continued. Your perspective would be valuable. Not just your experience with the fund, but your personal journey, understanding what it means to have one's dignity compromised and then reclaimed. That's expertise we need. Her words caught me off guard. I had never thought of my difficult experience in Paul and Vanessa's home as something that might qualify as expertise, something that could contribute meaningfully to institutional change. I'll consider it carefully, I promised, genuinely, touched by her recognition that personal experience could be as valuable as professional credentials. Later that afternoon, Paul picked me up in his modestly practical sedan, so different from the luxury vehicles he'd favored during his marriage, to Vanessa. Claire sat in the back seat, surrounded by elaborate gift bags filled with what appeared to be hundreds of homemade cookies. I might have gotten carried away, she admitted with a self-deprecating laugh. Stress baking, end-of-year library budget, meetings. The nursing graduates will appreciate it, I assured her, turning to Paul. How was your day? Productive, he replied. The financial literacy program is expanding to 3 more library branches next month. And we finally secured corporate sponsorship for the textbook fund. The ease with which he now discussed community initiatives rather than investment portfolios or status acquisitions still sometimes surprised me. This gradual but profound shift in priorities had transformed him from someone I barely recognized back into a person I was proud to call my son. The graduation ceremony was held in Emory's historic Glen Memorial Chapel, its stained glass windows glowing softly in the winter afternoon light. I sat between Paul and Claire in the family section, watching as white-coated nursing students filed into the chapel, their faces alight with the particular glow of hard-won achievement. When the dean called my name to offer remarks, I approached the podium with calm confidence that would have been unimaginable to the woman who had eaten silent meals at her son's kitchen island. Nursing is not merely a profession, I began, looking out at the sea of attentive faces. It is a sacred responsibility to see people at their most vulnerable and affirm their humanity. When patients enter healthcare settings, they often leave behind the markers of identity that define them in the world: their clothes, their privacy, their autonomy. What remains is their essential humanity, which must be recognized and honored by those entrusted with their care. I spoke about the practical support our fund provided, but emphasized that the material assistance was in service of a deeper purpose, ensuring that these new healthcare professionals could practice their calling without compromising their own dignity through financial strain or unsuitable living conditions. The ability to offer dignity to others begins with experiencing it yourself, I concluded. May you carry that awareness with you into every patient encounter, every professional relationship, every moment of your practice. The applause that followed was warm and genuine. As I returned to my seat, I caught Paul's eye, the pride in his expression unmistakable and deeply moving. After the ceremony, we mingled at the reception, Claire's cookies proving predictably popular among the graduates and their families. I was speaking with one of our scholarship recipients and her parents when I noticed an unexpected figure across the room. Louisa, elegant in a simple navy dress, accompanied by Elena in her nursing uniform. "Excuse me," I said to the family, making my way through the crowd to greet them. "Louisa, Elena, what a wonderful surprise." Louisa embraced me warmly. "Elena is starting her position at Emory next month," she explained proudly. She wanted to attend the ceremony to support her former classmates. "And to thank you again," Elena added. "The fund made all the difference. I've just signed a lease on an apartment 5 minutes from the hospital. No roommates, no hour-long commute." As we chatted, I noticed Paul approaching hesitantly, his expression suggesting he was uncertain of his welcome. Louisa had forgiven his complicity in Vanessa's treatment of her, but their interactions remained somewhat formal, laden with the weight of past hierarchies. "Louisa," he greeted her respectfully, "it's good to see you. Elena, congratulations on the Emory position. They're fortunate to have you." "Thank you, Mr. Carter," Elena replied politely. "Paul, please," he corrected gently. Mr. Carter sounds like my father. This small request to be addressed by his first name, to remove the formal distance that had once characterized his relationships with people he considered staff, was yet another indication of how thoroughly his perspective had shifted. Paul, Elena acknowledged with a nod, her smile warming slightly. The conversation that followed was initially stilted, but gradually eased into something more natural as Paul asked thoughtful questions about Elena's nursing specialization, and Louisa spoke of her new position with a family that respected her expertise and boundaries. Claire joined us, her easy warmth helping to dissolve lingering tensions. Later, as we drove home through the softly falling snow, Paul seemed contemplative. It's still strange sometimes, he said, seeing Louisa and Elena in completely different contexts, recognizing them as people with their own aspirations, their own lives beyond their relationship to us. That's the essence of dignity, Claire observed from the back seat. Seeing people as full human beings, not just in relation to ourselves. It seems so obvious now, Paul said, shaking his head slightly. I can't believe how blind I was. We all have blind spots, I said gently. The question is whether we're willing to acknowledge them when they're pointed out to us. He reached over and squeezed my hand briefly. I'm grateful you had the courage to point out mine, Mom, even though I didn't appreciate it at the time. The days leading up to Christmas brought a flurry of activity at Magnolia Gardens. The community had developed rich holiday traditions over the years, a resident-led choir, a festive dinner featuring family recipes contributed by each household, a gift exchange focused on handmade or personally meaningful items rather than commercial value. Paul and Claire arrived on Christmas Eve afternoon, arms laden with packages and food contributions. Claire had made her grandmother's traditional Swedish cardamom bread, while Paul carried a pot of his increasingly confident homemade chili for the potluck dinner. The apartment looks beautiful, Mom, Paul said, taking in the tasteful decorations I'd arranged. Boughs of fresh pine on the mantel, a small tree adorned with ornaments collected throughout my life, including several made by Paul as a child, that I'd carefully preserved. Dorothy helped, I acknowledged. She's an artist with greenery, and Mr. Abernathy contributed the poinsettias from the greenhouse. As we prepared for the evening's festivities, I was struck by the comfortable familiarity that had developed between us. There was none of the strained politeness that had characterized our interactions during the years I lived in his and Vanessa's home, none of the careful navigation around sensitive topics. Instead, we moved around each other with the easy rhythm of people who genuinely enjoyed one another's company. The community dinner was held in the main hall, transformed for the occasion with twinkling lights and festive centerpieces created by the garden club. Residents and their visiting family members filled long tables, the generations mixing comfortably as serving dishes were passed and stories were shared. Dorothy had saved seats for us at her table, where she held court with Mr. Abernathy and several other garden club stalwarts. At 93, she remained the undisputed social center of Magnolia Gardens, her sharp wit and accumulated wisdom drawing people to her like moths to a flame. "So you're Paul," she said when introductions were made, fixing him with her penetrating gaze. "Your mother's told me about your financial literacy program. Good work that. Practical knowledge people can use." "Thank you," Paul replied, clearly a bit taken aback by her directness, but warming to her approval. "It's been more rewarding than I expected." "Most meaningful things are," she observed, helping herself to Claire's cardamom bread. "This is excellent. By the way, old family recipe?" Claire nodded, delighted by the recognition. "My grandmother's. She brought it from Stockholm in 1932. The conversation flowed naturally from there, spanning topics from garden planning for the spring to community initiatives to family traditions. I watched as Paul and Claire integrated seamlessly into this community that had become my home, their genuine interest in my friends evident in their thoughtful questions and attentive listening. After dinner came the highlight of Magnolia Gardens' Christmas Eve celebration, a wisdom exchange, where residents shared brief reflections on lessons learned throughout their lives. The tradition had begun years before as a counterpoint to the materialistic focus of holiday gift-giving, an acknowledgement that the greatest gift many of us could offer was the perspective gained through decades of living. I hadn't planned to participate, having attended only one previous Christmas at Magnolia Gardens. But as the sharing moved around the room, Dorothy nudged me encouragingly. "Go on," she whispered. "You've earned some wisdom worth sharing." When my turn came, I stood somewhat hesitantly. 2 years ago, I began, I found myself eating Christmas dinner alone in my son's kitchen while his family entertained guests in the dining room. I had made myself small, invisible, convinced that this diminishment was the price of maintaining family connection. I was aware of Paul's pained expression but continued, my voice strengthening. "What I've learned since then is that dignity isn't something others can bestow or withhold from us. It's inherent, and we honor it not by demanding recognition from others but by refusing to participate in our own erasure. Sometimes that means making difficult choices, setting painful boundaries. But what follows can be richer and more authentic than what was lost." The murmurs of agreement that rippled through the room assured me that my experience, though personal, resonated widely. Many of these elders had navigated their own versions of invisibility, retirement pushing them to the social margins, adult children making decisions for rather than with them, a culture that often equated aging with irrelevance. After the formal program ended, people lingered in small groups, continuing conversations and enjoying the pianist's gentle renditions of holiday classics. Claire had been drawn into a discussion with several residents interested in establishing a book club, while Paul helped serve coffee and dessert, moving with natural ease among people decades his senior. I found myself standing somewhat apart, watching the scene with a sense of quiet fulfillment. Dorothy appeared beside me, following my gaze to where Paul was earnestly discussing something with Mr. Abernathy, his body language open and attentive. "He's not the same man who relegated you to the kitchen, is he?" she observed. "No," I agreed. "He's becoming more like his father, the good parts, the generosity of spirit, the genuine interest in others." "And you're not the same woman who accepted that treatment," she added. "That's the miracle in all this. Not just that he changed, but that you did." Her observation stayed with me through the remainder of the evening and into the next morning as we exchanged gifts in my apartment. The presents themselves were thoughtful but modest. Books carefully chosen to reflect individual interests, handcrafted items, donations made in each other's names to causes we supported. Paul's gift to me was a beautifully bound photo album, its pages documenting the development of the greenhouse project from initial construction through the Harvest Festival. The final pages held photographs I hadn't seen before, candid shots of me working with the garden club, teaching children during school visits, speaking at the fund's anniversary event. "Claire took these," Paul explained as I turned the pages, slowly. "I wanted you to see yourself as others see you now, engaged, respected, making a difference." The contrast with my invisible years in his home hung unspoken between us, but without recrimination. The album represented not just acknowledgement of past wounds, but celebration of healing and growth. Claire's gift was equally meaningful, a set of blank journals with a note explaining that she'd been inspired by my late husband's practice of daily reflection. Paul shared how important Robert's journals have been in reconnecting him with his father's wisdom, she wrote. "Perhaps your thoughts and experiences might similarly guide future generations." The suggestion that my perspective might be valuable enough to preserve, that my journey might offer guidance to others, touched me deeply. I had spent so many years focusing on others, my students, my family, that the idea of documenting my own wisdom felt simultaneously foreign and affirming. Later that day, as we prepared to leave for Christmas dinner at Claire's sister's house, Paul paused in the doorway of my apartment. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," he said, "about refusing to participate in your own erasure. That's exactly what you did when you made that call to Attorney Phillips. You refused to continue the pattern we had established." "It wasn't easy," I admitted. "Decades of conditioning told me to stay quiet, to be grateful for whatever space I was allowed to occupy." "I'm sorry I was part of that conditioning," he said, his expression solemn. "And I'm grateful every day that you found the courage to break it, not just for yourself, but for me too. You freed us both." As we drove through the winter landscape toward Claire's sister's home, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment of genuine connection. The path from that cold kitchen island to this warm relationship hadn't been smooth or direct. It had required painful confrontations, legal interventions, significant losses, and genuine change on both our parts. Yet here we were, moving forward together with clear eyes and open hearts. My decision to stand up for my own dignity, to make that one call that changed their address, had set in motion a cascade of transformations that continued to unfold in unexpected ways. Claire's sister lived in a modest home in a diverse neighborhood, her family a warm blend of various backgrounds and configurations. The welcome we received was genuine, the atmosphere unpretentious and joyful. As introductions were made and food was shared, I observed Paul navigating this new family constellation with authentic engagement, so different from the calculated social performance that had characterized his life with Vanessa. During a quiet moment after dinner, as others were engaged in a boisterous game in the living room, Claire's sister Meredith joined me in the kitchen where I was preparing tea. "Claire has told me your story," she said without preamble, "about what happened with Paul and his ex-wife, about standing up for yourself. It gave me the courage to have a difficult conversation with my own mother-in-law about boundaries. Thank you for that." Her words reminded me again of Dorothy's insight, that the impact of our choices extends far beyond our immediate circumstances, creating ripples that touch lives we may never even encounter directly. As the evening wound down, I found myself filled with a profound sense of gratitude, not just for the obvious blessings of family and community, but for the difficult journey that had led to this more authentic life. The pain of being marginalized in my son's home, the courage required to make that transformative phone call, the uncertainty of rebuilding a life on my own terms, all of it had been necessary to arrive at this place of genuine connection and purpose. When we returned to Magnolia Gardens that night, the snow had begun again, transforming the familiar landscape into something magical and new. Paul walked me to my door, lingering for a moment in the peaceful quiet. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For not giving up on me, for showing me a better way to live, for making that call." I squeezed his hand, words unnecessary between us now. As he turned to go, I stood in the doorway watching his retreating figure, remembering another doorway years before, the night I'd been asked to eat in the kitchen while guests were entertained in the dining room. That night, I had silently accepted the diminishment. I had believed accommodation was the price of belonging. I had made myself invisible to maintain peace. But in that very invisibility, in that quiet moment of painful clarity, I had found the seed of transformation. I had discovered that true dignity could not be conferred or withheld by others. It could only be claimed by oneself, sometimes at significant cost. The single call I made that night had indeed changed their address, forcing Paul and Vanessa from their prestigious home to more modest accommodations. But the more profound change had been in the invisible geography of our relationships, with each other, with ourselves, with the wider community. I closed my door against the winter cold, surveying the apartment that had become genuinely mine in a way no space had been since Robert's death. The photo album Paul had given me lay open on the coffee table, images of my engaged, visible self, a testament to the journey I had undertaken. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, The ongoing work with the Elena Johnson Fund, Dr. Martinez's Patient Dignity Initiative, the continued nurturing of my relationship with Paul. But tonight, in the quiet of Christmas night, I allowed myself to simply be present with the knowledge that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is refuse to accept invisibility, to make one call that changes everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.